And now I'm very happy to introduce James Aaron Green. He works at the University of Vienna and will talk about something that I'm very interested in, about Victorian sensation fiction and the prehistory of the spoiler. Because of course, the spoiler for people working in literature studies is quite an old phenomenon, I think. And he has a project as a fellow at the University of Vienna, an apart GSK fellow, and he examines fictions of radical life extensions that were published between 1878 and 1918. And he specializes in the intersections of popular fiction and science, and is also interested in game studies. His monograph will be published this year with Palgrave Macmillan, and it's called Sensation Fiction and Modernity. And now we're very curious about what we'll hear on Victorian fiction.
Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today and talking to you. Yes, the title of my paper is Telling the Story Secondhand, Victorian Sensation Fiction and the Prehistory of the Spoiler. And so it's impossible, of course, to predict the future, but at least for the present, I think we can think of 2019 as the high watermark in terms of the ubiquity of the spoiler in Western mass media culture. 2019 was a year that saw the culmination of two media franchises that had dominated television and film for a decade: HBO's fantasy series Game of Thrones and Marvel's superhero saga Avengers Endgame. Their releases and the long build-up towards them prompted a wide-ranging discussion about the spoiler, about summaries or descriptions that reveal key aspects of plot. There were guides written on how to live spoiler-free in the online world, and there were also displays of extreme behavior in the physical world, most notoriously someone being assaulted outside a Hong Kong cinema when they were accused of revealing spoilers to Avengers Endgame. And the co-directors of that film went so far as to ask publicly that audiences avoid revealing its spoilers, signaling how what was once just something that was a part of media reception only, i.e. extrinsic to the text, was now being thought of as a narrative element in its own right. Truly, then, the spoiler seemed to have arrived as a crucial and much debated part of contemporary popular culture. But for me, what was interesting was that the debate surrounding these media events perpetuated an idea that this was a 21st century development, arising from some of the factors I give here. The immediate transmissibility and accessibility of plot details through the internet, and especially social media, the creation of extended, years-long serialized products that were released simultaneously to global audiences, and also the value placed upon experiencing fiction without foreknowledge of the plot. And in his book, Spoiler Alert, also released in 2019, it seemed to be just that year, Richard Green describes, or dates really, the spoiler's origin to the mid-20th century, singling out Agatha Christie's West End play, The Mousetrap, which famously since 1952 has asked its audiences not to reveal the twist ending. As a Victorianist, though, I had to disagree and to really try and suggest that the reaction to the release of Wilkie Collins's novel, The Woman in White, released in 1859-60, almost 100 years before The Mousetrap, was really, in some respects, the first meditations on the spoiler as we would understand it today. It was framed by different language and by different cultural assumptions and critical contexts, but nonetheless, I think we can see very much the parallels and those comparisons. So what this paper tries to do, therefore, is consider some of those moments before, during, and after the release of The Woman in White to gauge their historical importance and to gauge their contemporary relevance as well. And I think by examining them, we can get a closer, deeper sense of the social conditions in which spoilers gain cultural significance, as well as what lies behind the polarizing responses that they continue to foster. So, like other examples of Victorian sensation fiction, Collins's The Woman in White is a tightly plotted novel that hinges upon a central mystery, which is only revealed gradually in stages. It was released serially in 10 parts between November 1859 and August 1860, which meant that readers had to wait at least a month at a time to learn the latest development. But what makes it especially significant in the history of the prehistory of the spoiler is how Collins chose to engage with the critics when the book was released in volume form in 1860. So thinking of readers who may not have read the serial and who were therefore coming to the text fresh, he writes the following preface. Is it possible to praise the writer or to blame him without opening the proceedings by telling his story at second hand? No small portion of this space, i.e. of the novel itself, is occupied by hundreds of little connecting links. If he tells it at all, is he doing a service to the reader by destroying beforehand two main elements in the attraction of all stories, the interest of curiosity and the excitement of surprise? And Collins's question is far from a rhetorical one, because British critics of the 19th century often devoted a large portion of their very lengthy word limits to giving detailed synopses of the works they were reviewing. And before, in fact, I examine the reaction to Collins's request with The Woman in White, I want to just briefly take us back up to a decade before to consider what prompted him to ask this of the critics. So, Collins's second published novel, Basil, was released in 1852, and unlike The Woman in White, doesn't hinge on a single central mystery. Nonetheless, the sequence of events, the plot, is still what drew readers in. And when the critics came to review Basil at the start of the new year, the Dublin University magazine summarized most of what happens. But interestingly, they decided to stop at the conclusion. And of this part of the story, they said, over this part of the story, we must drop a veil. They didn't give their reasons, but we can start to gain a sense perhaps of why by looking at a review of another Collins novel, Hide and Seek, published 2 years later in 1854. Geraldine Dewsbury, reviewing for the Athenaeum magazine, also opted against giving details of the plot. And she finishes her piece with a telling remark: we will not spoil the reader's interest in the book by developing the story. So it's only a very short detail, but I think the implication is very clear. The interest from the reader's perspective in this book lies in discovering what happens via the reading process itself, and that experience is compromised if the events are given beforehand in a summarized form. But this tendency to avoid summarizing the plot in order to spare readers' interest was far from universal. Collins's novel, The Dead Secret, published in 1857, so 3 years later, was also reviewed in the Athenaeum, but this time by a different reviewer, Horace St. John. And unlike Dewsbury, he gives the novel's plot in full. He also, though, prefaces that synopsis with this suggestive remark. He says, no injustice will be done to Mr. Collins if we trace the outline of his story before estimating its qualities as a work of art. And so, for all that St. John decides to spoil the novel by revealing its plot, what is intriguing is that he feels required to justify his approach, which was, after all, standard at the time, This was what the reviewers were all doing. And his use of the word injustice indicates a certain sort of self-consciousness about his process, what it is intending to achieve, and whom it affects, i.e. the reader of this review and of the fiction. In other words, he chooses to sort of defy it, but there is evidently some pressure and some anxiety about the disclosure of plot details, even in 1857. Of the same text, the Saturday Review adopts a different approach. It too describes the plot at length, but it afterwards explains its choice by saying, the interest of the story hangs not upon the nature of the secret, but upon the mode in which it is discovered. And they say, they give this explanation because they say, the secret is very plainly discernible in the opening of the novel. For this reviewer, it's not revealing a secret per se that risks readers' interests, but it's revealing one that's unable to be guessed at and whose discovery via reading is therefore going to create a sense of surprise. I think here what we have is an instance of what Vera Tobin in her 2018 monograph, The Elements of Surprise, has described as the well-made surprise. She says, the tradition of the well-made surprise asks, has this revelation been built on an expertly crafted foundation? It places highest value on the satisfactions that come from the sense that the plot is a finely constructed mechanism, a well-oiled trap. The surprise should not be merely unexpected, but also revelatory. And I would suggest that the well-made surprise is really the foundation of the spoiler, and that failing to meet this criteria, as Collins's novel The Dead Secret apparently does, the Saturday Review feels absolutely no guilt in revealing its plot details. It's not a spoiler if the reader's interest is not risked by revelation. So, to return to 1860, however, how did the critics respond to Collins's unusual request that they keep their reviews of The Woman in White spoiler-free, as we would perhaps now call it? The first thing to note is how many of the reviewers explicitly talk about the request that Collins made, indicating, I think, just how unusual it was. Perhaps surprising, therefore, is the extent to which they actually accept it. The Morning Advertiser thought it was very reasonable, and as a result, they decided to completely omit plot details from their review. The Critic magazine did the same, but they also added a telling detail. They said, it is difficult for readers to predict what will happen to a certain character in the novel. The implication being, therefore, that it's a reasonable request because the novel's surprises are, in Vera Tobin's definition, well made. So the inability for the plot twist to be guessed at means that to reveal it secondhand would be detrimental to its enjoyment. The Saturday Review also complied with Collins's request, and they explained their reasoning as follows. On the present occasion, it would be unnecessary and perhaps unfair to the story, considering its nature, to analyze it in detail. And what I find interesting about this is the Saturday Review recognizing that there is something particular, perhaps something new about The Woman in White in terms of its storytelling that justifies a suspension of how they would normally review fiction. They don't entirely change their reviewing habits, however. What they do is settle on a compromise, and their reviewer says, sort of negotiates with their readers. They say, we will drop an occasional hint, a dark allusion to the plot, while avoiding complete disclosure. The Guardian also accepted Collins's request, but they justified their approach in terms of the reader. They said, to betray the plot to those who are ignorant of it would be to take the edge from their enjoyment. I've given their fuller excerpt here. Dewsbury, having some years before referred to the spoiling of readers' interest in the story, this Guardian piece now sees the story itself as what is liable to be spoilt by disclosing the plot. This is not quite a discussion of the spoiler yet, per se, but it is, I think, a discussion of it in all but name, effectively. It emerges, these discussions seem to indicate, from an unprecedented, even exclusive emphasis upon plot as the interest of this fiction, as well as the structuring of that plot according to rhythms of suspense and rhythms of revelation. And there is already, really fascinatingly, an awareness of how decisive this effect is going to be upon readers' enjoyment, upon writers, and upon critics, what they have to do to adapt their practices to account for it. Collins's request prompted, if not a full-scale trend, I'm not saying that, then it did at least prompt imitations. A fellow writer of sensation fiction, Mary Elizabeth Braddon, had achieved huge success with Lady Audley's Secret, published in 1862. Even more than that novel, though, her follow-up, Henry Dunbar, is structured around readers being unaware of a certain secret that is not revealed until the very conclusion. And in the preface to the novel, she therefore makes this request. She says the author has to make the same appeal to the critics which has been made by an eminent novelist on a previous occasion, not to describe the plot. The story Henry Dunbar pretends to be nothing more than a story, the revealment of which is calculated to weaken the interest of the general reader, for whose amusement the tale is written. So Braddon here draws explicitly upon Collins's precedent from 4 years earlier to give her greater authority, but she also employs a distinct rhetorical strategy. She tries to overturn dominant ideas about the purpose of fiction being didactic, being to improve readers' moral and intellectual status. And she instead situates her work in an alternative tradition of pure storytelling. She just says it's unpretentious, it's frivolous. The reviews that I've encountered didn't respond positively to the appeal, however. The Examiner noted Braddon's request, but it refused to adhere to it. They suggested, returning us to the idea of Tobin's idea of the well-made surprise, that the central mystery is in fact manifest from the beginning, they say. It isn't revelatory, and therefore it doesn't deserve to be concealed. The Times, on the other hand, went further and suggested that Braddon's premise of trying to conceal plot details was altogether mistaken. For them, the pleasures of novel reading wouldn't depend on ignorance of a story's conclusion. The readers would be more intrigued by how the plot unfolds than what it contains. So the Times thereby raises a topic that I think is still of ongoing concern today. Does knowing the plot in advance spoil a work, or does it simply create alternative pleasures? And I think clearly, even if there's distinct language being used and the debate is framed by different cultural considerations and assumptions, there is a lot of continuity between this discussion in the 1860s and nowadays in terms of our thinking about the spoiler and its effects. So in the decades after Collins and then Braddon made their appeals, the issues that they raised were still unsettled. Reviewing the novel Behind the Veil in 1871, the Saturday Review confessed to finding suspense unpleasant. They said they preferred to know how the story would unfold in advance, but they admitted they were not the majority of readers for whom, in their words, the anxiety to discover the end was a great part of the enjoyment of fiction. Unfortunately, this didn't stop them from revealing the entire plot of the novel that they were reviewing, including the death of its villain and the final conclusion. So the reviewer apparently saw no contradiction in observing the delights of discovery and then denying that possibility to readers. This wasn't the universal approach, however, and to take just another example from slightly later, in 1886, when the Graphic magazine came to review a novel called Double Cunning, they recognized that this type of novel required them to avoid discussing plot in the standard way. And they said, we shall avoid spoiling the effect by giving the least hint of its plot, the interest of which depends altogether upon the readers coming to it with complete freshness and openness of mind. And so we have here two examples of very different approaches thrown up, different approaches to the spoiler and the issues that it threw up, showing how it really remained quite divisive, quite unsettled, even sort of many decades on. It was really the idiosyncrasies of the reviewer that were the only thing which could determine whether a reader might find the plot given away entirely in a review, or whether a polite veil would be drawn over its contents. So, to conclude this paper, I just want to return us very quickly to 2019 and to the appeal made by the co-directors of Avengers Endgame, the Russo brothers. I don't know whether anyone saw this either at the time or has seen it subsequently. It fascinates me. They posted this on the social media platform Twitter to a global audience, and you can see some of the numbers that it has done there. 156,000 likes, goodness knows how many more views. That makes it seem, of course, like a very 21st century artifact. It is enabled by internet technology. It is directed to consumers of a multimedia franchise that is worth to Disney many billions of dollars. But I like to think that its contemporaneity is beguiling. True, the financial and chronological extent of these franchises may be unprecedented, as the co-directors say in their note. But this paper has shown that creators appealing for the plot of their works to remain secret is a phenomenon that can be traced back to the aftermath of at least Collins's The Woman in White in 1859 to 60. Then, as now, the anxieties aroused by the spoiler are such as to move artists and creators to intervene on behalf of their audiences to protect their interest. Then, as now, debates occasioned by the spoiler prompt us to question the purpose and pleasure to be derived from fiction, as well as our methods of analysing them. Thank you very much.